My name is Silas Vane, and I am 34 years old. For most of my life, I believed that blood was thicker than water, until the Tuesday morning a stranger in a charcoal suit handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope that smelled faintly of expensive cologne and betrayal. I stood in the doorway of my third-floor walk-up, the radiator hissing behind me, watching the man walk away without a word. When I broke the seal and saw the words petition for involuntary conservatorship stamped in cold block letters, the world didn't just stop, it fractured. My own parents were coming for my life, not to save it but to own it. To understand why a mother and father would try to legally erase their son's autonomy, you have to understand the ghosts that lived in the Vane household. My parents, Alistair and Alina Vane, were architects of perception. Growing up in the high society circles of Silver Oaks, our life was a curated gallery of success. My father was a high-stakes investment banker, my mother, a former concert pianist turned socialite. Everything had to be pristine. Every hair in place, every grade an A+, every smile a practiced masterpiece. But inside that sprawling manor, the air was heavy with a silence that screamed. Then there was my brother Julian. He was the golden child, a mirror image of my father's predatory ambition. He played the game, wore the suits, and chased the bonuses. I was the glitch in their perfect system. While Julian was networking at golf clubs, I was in the basement of the university library, losing myself in the tactile history of the world. I didn't care for stocks or luxury watches. I cared for the scent of old parchment, the weight of a 19th century letter, and the stories of people the world had forgotten. To my parents, this wasn't a passion, it was a mental deficiency. The real rift happened a decade ago on the night of my 24th birthday. We were sitting in a restaurant where the wine cost more than my monthly rent. My father pushed a leather-bound folder toward me. It's a position at the firm, Sila's, junior analyst. It's time to stop playing with dusty paper and start building a legacy. I remember looking at him, then at my mother, who was delicately cutting her steak as if she were performing surgery. I told them no. I told them I had accepted a position as a lead researcher at the Heritage Preservation Trust. The silence that followed was colder than the ice in my glass. "You are choosing to be a failure," my father whispered. That night, I didn't go back to the manor. I walked to a bus station with nothing but my laptop and the clothes on my back. I chose the failure of freedom over the success of a cage. For 10 years, I built my fortress of solitude. I worked 12-hour shifts, lived on instant noodles, and climbed the ladder of the archival world with blood, sweat, and tears. I didn't just survive, I thrived in the shadows. I bought a modest apartment, saved every penny, and cultivated a life that was quiet, intentional, and entirely mine. We spoke twice a year, stilted 5-minute calls that felt like depositions. I thought I was safe. I thought they had finally accepted that I was lost to them. But the envelope proved that the veins never lose, they just wait for the right moment to strike. The petition claimed I was emotionally volatile, financially incapable, and suffering from a prolonged break with reality. They were using my love for history and my quiet lifestyle as evidence of a crumbling mind. They wanted the court to grant them total control over my finances, my medical decisions, and my residence. They wanted to drag me back to the manor, strip me of my name, and turn me into a tax write-off. As I sat on my sofa, the legal papers trembling in my hand, a dark, cold fire began to burn in my chest. They thought I was still that quiet boy who hid in the library to escape their shouting. They thought because I didn't shout, I didn't have a voice. They were wrong. I had spent a decade studying the patterns of the past, the way empires fall, and the way secrets eventually rot from the inside out. I wasn't just an archivist. I was a gatekeeper of truths. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had kept in my wallet for 5 years. The woman who answered didn't offer sympathy. She offered a blade. Her name was Evelyn Thorne, a legal shark who specialized in breaking the unbreakable chains of family coercion. "Silas Vane," she said, her voice like grinding stone. I've been expecting your call. Your parents have been making inquiries about you for months. Don't panic. We aren't going to just defend you. We are going to dismantle them. Evelyn Thorne's office was located in a repurposed industrial loft, a space defined by exposed brick, cold concrete, and a silence that felt heavy with strategic intent. When I walked in the following morning, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She didn't offer me coffee or ask how I was holding up. She simply pointed to a chair and spread a copy of the petition across her glass desk. Your parents are using a slow burn strategy, Evelyn began, her eyes scanning the legal jargon with predatory focus. They aren't claiming you've lost your mind overnight. They're claiming a decade of regression. They've documented every time you missed a family event, every modest paycheck you earned, and every month you spent in isolation as evidence of a person who cannot function in the modern world. They want to paint you as a hermit who has lost his grip on reality. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I'm not a hermit, I'm a researcher, I have a career, I have a life. To the court, Silas, those are just words, Evelyn countered, leaning forward. To a judge, you look like a man with no significant assets, a low-paying job, and a family that is willing to spend a fortune to save him. In the eyes of the law, their wealth looks like stability, and your simplicity looks like a cry for help. We need to flip the script. We need to show them that while they were looking down on you, you were building something they couldn't even imagine. I spent the next 3 hours pouring out my life to her. I told her about the meticulously organized ledgers I kept, the way I had invested my meager inheritance from my grandmother into rare, undervalued historical manuscripts that were now worth a fortune. I told her about the 1968 classic sports car I had restored with my own hands in a rented garage, a vehicle now valued at 6 figures. I told her about my quiet, disciplined life. But mostly, I told her about the fear, the deep ancestral fear of being pulled back into the Vane household, where love was a leash and affection was a weapon. Evelyn listened, her pen flying across her notepad. They think they are the hunters, she whispered, a ghost of a smile appearing on her lips. They think they are coming for a sheep. They have no idea you've spent 10 years building a fortress, but we need to be careful. If they realize you have resources, they will shift their tactics from concern to aggression. We need them to walk into that courtroom feeling overconfident. We need them to think they've already won. She instructed me to go back to my life to be boringly normal. And I was to avoid all contact with my parents and my brother. If they called, I was to let it go to voicemail. If they showed up at my door, I was to call the police. This is a psychological war, Silas, she warned. They will try to trigger you. They will try to make you look unstable in public. Do not give them an inch. The week that followed was a descent into a special kind of hell. My phone was a constant source of anxiety. I received concerned texts from my mother, asking if I had eaten, telling me how much they missed me, and subtly mentioning how unwell I sounded during our last call. My brother Julian sent a message that made my blood boil. Just come home, see, stop making this difficult. Dad can make all this legal stuff go away if you just show us you're willing to listen. It was a trap wrapped in the guise of brotherhood. I deleted the messages and focused on my work at the trust. I buried myself in the records of the 19th century textile mills, finding comfort in the logical progression of history. But even there, I felt watched. A dark SUV parked across the street from my office for 3 days straight. A man I didn't recognize followed me into a grocery store, staying 2 aisles away but always within sight. My parents weren't just suing me, they were stalking me. On Friday night, Evelyn called. Her voice sounded different, sharper, more energized. We've finished the preliminary background check on your father's firm, Silas. Remember how I told you that wealth looks like stability to a judge? Well, it turns out Alistair Vane's stability is a house of cards. His firm is under investigation for a major offshore tax evasion scheme, and his personal accounts have been bleeding out for 18 months. They aren't trying to save you, Silas. They're trying to harvest you. They need your clean credit, your name, and any assets you have to move money before the feds freeze their accounts. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just about control. It wasn't even about their twisted version of love. It was a liquidation. I was their exit strategy. Does this mean we win? I asked, my voice trembling. No, Evelyn said. It means the fight just got a lot more dangerous. Because now they aren't just fighting for your life, they're fighting for their own. We have the hearing in 10 days. Until then, you are a ghost. Do you understand? You do not exist to them. I hung up the phone and looked around my apartment. The books, the maps, the quiet, it was all at stake. I walked over to my desk and picked up a small, weathered journal I had acquired years ago, the diary of a man who had survived a shipwreck by documenting every detail of his struggle. I realized then that I was in my own storm. And like that man, I would survive by being more meticulous, more patient, and more ruthless than the waves trying to pull me under. The days leading up to the hearing were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I lived like a monk in a cathedral of my own making, moving between my apartment and the archives with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. I knew that every step I took was likely being recorded, every interaction scrutinized by a private investigator looking for a crack in my composure. My parents were experts at finding the faulty parts of my soul, and I refused to give them a single tremor of my hand to report back. On a Tuesday, exactly 1 week before the court date, my mother attempted a different angle of attack. I was leaving the archives when I saw her standing by my car. She wasn't the cold, calculating woman from my childhood. She was wearing a soft, morning gray cardigan, her eyes red-rimmed as if she had been crying for hours. It was a performance that would have won an Oscar. Silas, she whispered, reaching out a hand that trembled perfectly. Please just talk to me. We are so scared for you. Your father hasn't slept in weeks. We only want what's best for our son. For a second, the old Silas, the boy who used to crave her approval, wanted to reach back. But then I saw the black SUV parked half a block away, and I noticed the way her eyes darted toward it, checking for a cue. She wasn't there as a mother, she was there as a witness for their lawyer. If I shouted, I was aggressive. If I cried, I was unstable. Contact my attorney, Alina, I said, using her first name for the first time in my life. The mask of the grieving mother didn't just slip, it evaporated. Her face hardened into a mask of pure aristocratic frost. You've become a very cold man, Silas, she spat, her voice no longer trembling. And that coldness is exactly why you aren't fit to be left alone. We made you, we can break you. She turned and walked toward the SUV without looking back. That was the moment I stopped feeling like a son and started feeling like a soldier. I went straight to Evelyn's office. I didn't need to tell her what happened. She already had a photo sent to her by her own investigator who had been counterstalking my parents. She tried to bait you, Evelyn said, tossing a high-resolution photo of my mother on the desk. And you handled it perfectly. But we have a problem. Your father's lawyer, a man named Sterling Vance, no relation to your father, just a namesake coincidence, has filed a motion to freeze your bank accounts effective immediately, claiming you've been dissipating assets on fringe hobbies. Can they do that? I asked, my heart hammering. They can try, but they don't know about the secret accounts, Evelyn smiled. And they certainly don't know about the vault. Silas, the court is going to appoint an independent evaluator to visit your apartment tomorrow. They want to see how you live. This is the hoarder or hermit check. They are hoping to find a mess, piles of old paper, and signs of neglect. The next day, a woman named Dr. Eris arrived at my door. She was clinical, observant, and carried a clipboard like a shield. She expected to walk into a den of obsession. Instead, she walked into a space that looked like a high-end gallery. My apartment was spotless. My books were cataloged behind UV-protected glass. My financial records were color-coded in a locked filing cabinet. I had prepared a digital presentation of my work for the trust, showing the millions of dollars in grants I had secured for historical preservation. As she moved through my home, she stopped at the small shelf where I kept my most prized possession, a collection of letters from a soldier in the Revolutionary War to his wife. I hadn't just bought them, I had restored them from rotting fragments. Why do you do this? As she asked, her voice losing some of its clinical edge. Because the past is the only thing that doesn't lie, I said. People change their stories to suit their needs, they betray you, they rewrite their own history, but these letters, they are the truth of a moment. I preserve them because everyone deserves to have their truth protected. She looked at me for a long time, her pen hovering over her paper. She didn't say a word as she left, but she didn't need to. I saw her look at the photo on my wall, the only one I kept. It wasn't of my family. It was a photo of the first library I ever worked in, the place where I first realized I could be someone without their permission. That night, Evelyn called me with the final piece of the puzzle. Silas, we dug deeper into the tax evasion case against your father. It's worse than we thought. He didn't just hide money, he stole it from a client's trust fund to pay for Julian's failed real estate venture. If they don't get their hands on a large sum of clean money like yours, within the next month your father is going to prison. This isn't just a conservatorship, Silas, it's a kidnapping. I sat in the dark, watching the city lights flicker outside. The people who gave me life were trying to devour mine to stay warm. The betrayal was so deep it felt hollow. I realized then that the hearing wouldn't just be about my sanity, it would be an execution of the Vane family legacy. I wasn't going there to defend myself anymore, I was going there to end them. The morning of the hearing arrived with a sky the color of bruised iron. I dressed with a ritualistic focus, choosing a charcoal suit that was well tailored but understated. I wasn't trying to look like a millionaire, I was trying to look like a man who was in total control of his pulse. As I tied my silk tie, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The hollow-eyed boy who had fled the Vane Manor 10 years ago was gone. In his place stood a man who had survived the silence. Evelyn met me at the courthouse steps. She looked like she had been carved out of obsidian, sharp, dark, and unbreakable. The air inside is going to be thick with lies, Silas, she said, adjusting her cufflinks. They are going to talk about you as if you aren't in the room. They will use your virtues and call them vices. They will use your passion and call it a sickness. You will sit there, you will breathe, and you will not offer them a single tear. Let them perform. The higher they build their stage, the further they have to fall. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, which made the tension feel claustrophobic. My parents were already seated at the petitioner's table. My father, Alastair, looked every inch the titan of industry, though I noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his spectacles. My mother, Elena, sat beside him in a black dress that looked more like a queen's morning attire than a mother's choice for court. Julian sat behind them, looking bored, his eyes scanning his phone as if my life were a minor inconvenience in his schedule. Judge Miller, a woman with silver hair and a reputation for having a zero-tolerance policy for theatrics, took the bench. We are here for the matter of the petition for conservatorship of Silas Vane, she began, her voice echoing in the wood-paneled room. Mr. Sterling, you may open for the petitioners. Sterling Vance stood up. He was a man who spoke in paragraphs that sounded like legal contracts. He began to paint a devastating picture. He spoke of my unexplained departure from a loving home. He described my career as a regressive obsession with the dead and my apartment as the isolated bunker of a man unable to face the complexities of adult life. Your Honor, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a tone of practiced pity. The Vane family is not here out of malice. They are here because they have watched their eldest son slip away into a world of dusty shadows. Silas Vane earns a salary that barely covers his rent, yet he spends thousands on old papers and relics. He has no social circle, no romantic partners, and refuses to communicate with the people who love him most. We believe he is suffering from an avoidant personality disorder coupled with a delusional obsession that makes him vulnerable to financial ruin. They want to bring him home. They want to provide the structure he clearly lacks. Then he called my father to the stand. Alistair Vane walked to the witness box with a heavy, performative sigh. Under Sterling's questioning, he played the role of the heartbroken patriarch to perfection. I offered him everything, my father whispered, leaning toward the judge. A career, a legacy, a future. He threw it away for a job that pays him pennies. When I tried to help him manage his finances, he became paranoid. He cut us off. We found out he was spending his meager savings on manuscripts. As a father, how can I sit by and watch my son become a penniless hermit because of a mental block he refuses to acknowledge? I watched him, my face a mask of granite. I remembered the night he had called me a failure. I remembered the way he had hidden Julian's gambling debts while lecturing me on the value of $1. Evelyn stood up for the cross-examination. She didn't approach the witness box. She circled it like a shark. Mr. Vane, you say you are worried about your son's financial stability. Is that correct? Deeply, Alistair replied. And you believe his meager savings are being wasted? It's a pattern of irresponsibility, he said firmly. Interesting, Evelyn said, pulling a document from her folder. Because according to your own tax returns from the last 2 years, your firm has seen a 40% drop in revenue. You've refinanced your family manor twice in 18 months. Tell me, Mr. Vane, if the court grants this conservatorship, you would have total control over Silas's assets, wouldn't you? To protect them, yes, my father snapped. And if those assets turned out to be far more substantial than you worried they were, would that help settle the malpractice lawsuit currently pending against your firm in the Caymans? The room went silent. My father's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. That has nothing to do with this, Sterling shouted, jumping to his feet with an objection. It has everything to do with motive, Your Honor, Evelyn countered calmly. Judge Miller leaned forward, her eyes locked on my father. I'll allow the line of questioning. Mr. Vane, please answer the counselor. My father stammered, his polished facade cracking like cheap glass. He looked toward my mother, but she was staring at the floor, her hands twisting her pearls. For the first time in my life, I saw him small. I saw him desperate. And I realized that the man who had loomed over my nightmares for a decade was nothing more than a frightened thief looking for a way out. I am a successful man, my father finally hissed. I don't need my son's pennies. We shall see about the pennies shortly, Evelyn said, returning to our table. No further questions for this witness. As my father stepped down, he caught my eye. In that look, there was no love, no concern. There was only a cold, burning hatred. He wasn't my father anymore, he was my opponent, and the game was just beginning. After my father retreated from the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from clinical to combustible. The concerned parent narrative was bleeding out on the floor. To salvage their crumbling position, Sterling Vance called my mother, Elena, to the stand. This was the moment I feared most, not because she had facts, but because she had the power of the performance. Elena Vane didn't walk. She drifted to the stand, the image of a broken bird. She didn't look at my father or the lawyers. She looked directly at me, her eyes brimming with a manufactured sorrow that made my stomach churn. Under Sterling's gentle prodding, she began to weave a tale of a lost boy. Silas was always different, she said, her voice a melodic whisper. As a child, he would hide in the attic for days with old books. We thought it was a phase, but as he grew, the withdrawal became more profound. He stopped eating with the family. He stopped smiling. When he left us 10 years ago, it wasn't a choice, it was a breakdown. We have spent a decade mourning a son who is still alive but refuses to be found. This petition isn't about money. It's about bringing my boy back from the shadows before he disappears entirely. It was a brilliant play. She wasn't attacking my bank account, she was attacking my soul. She was telling the judge that my entire personality was a symptom of a disease. I felt the weight of the room's gaze shifting toward me, wondering if I truly was the hollow shell she described. Evelyn didn't wait for the silence to settle. She rose with a sharp, rhythmic click of her heels. Mrs. Vane, you say Silas was withdrawn and lost. In the 10 years since he left your home, how many times have you visited his apartment? Alina blinked, her composure wavering. He didn't invite us, he made it clear he wanted distance. So the answer is zero, Evelyn pressed. In 3,650 days, you never once knocked on his door to see if he was lost or found. I respected his boundaries, my mother said defensively. Or perhaps you didn't care enough to look, Evelyn countered. She pulled a photograph from her file. This is a photo of Silas's current residence. It's clean, organized, and filled with thousands of cataloged historical documents. Does this look like the home of a man who has lost his grip on reality, or does it look like the workspace of a professional who has outgrown his parents' narrow expectations? It's an obsession, Elena snapped, her voice losing its softness. It's not a life. Let's talk about that obsession, Evelyn said, turning to the judge. Your Honor, the petitioners claim my client is financially incompetent. They claim he lives on pennies. I would like to introduce the court-appointed financial audit of Silas Vane's estate. The bailiff handed a thick blue folder to Judge Miller. My father leaned forward so far he almost fell off his chair. Julian finally put his phone down. According to this audit, Evelyn began, her voice ringing out like a bell, Silas Vane is the sole owner of a debt-free condominium in the city center. He possesses a diversified investment portfolio valued at $600,000. But most importantly, his obsession, his collection of rare manuscripts and historical artifacts, has been appraised by the National Historical Board at a conservative market value of $32 million. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a vacuum. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. My father turned a ghostly shade of white, his eyes bulging as he stared at the folder in the judge's hand. 3.2 million, my father choked out, forgetting he wasn't supposed to speak. In addition, Evelyn continued, ignoring the outburst, Mr. Vane owns a fully restored 1968 Shelby Mustang, which he rebuilt himself, valued at $250,000. He has no debt, a perfect credit score, and is currently being scouted for a senior consultancy position at the Smithsonian. He isn't a hermit, Mrs. Vane. He is a self-made millionaire who did it all without a single cent of your structure or legacy. The judge looked from the papers to my parents. Her expression was no longer neutral, it was pointed. Mr. and Mrs. Vane, you stated under oath that your son was in a state of financial ruin and personal neglect. Yet, it appears he is more financially stable than the very firm that is petitioning for his control. We didn't know, my mother stammered, her bird-like persona completely gone. He hid it, he was secretive, it's a sign of someone who knows exactly who his predators are, Evelyn interrupted. Your Honor, Silas Vane didn't hide his success from the world. He only hid it from the two people who told him he would never amount to anything. And given the financial state of Alistair Vane's firm, I think it's quite clear why he chose to keep his fortress private. I looked at my parents. For the first time, I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel the need for their love. I felt a strange, cold pity. They had spent their lives chasing the appearance of wealth while I had spent mine building the reality of it. They were the ones in the shadows now. Judge Miller closed the folder with a heavy thud. I have heard enough for today. We will recess for 1 hour before I hear from the respondent himself. But I suggest the petitioners use this hour to reconsider their position very carefully. Because from where I'm sitting, this doesn't look like a conservatorship, it looks like a heist. As the room cleared, my father tried to approach me. He looked older, smaller, his expensive suit suddenly looking too big for him. Silas, he began, his voice cracking. We can talk about this, we're family. I didn't say a word, I simply looked at him, really looked at him, until he withered and turned away. I walked out of the courtroom with Evelyn, the air finally feeling light enough to breathe. The 1 hour recess felt like a lifetime suspended in amber. I sat in a small, sterile waiting room with Evelyn, the hum of the courthouse ventilation the only sound between us. She was reviewing her notes, her face a mask of tactical calm. I, however, felt a strange, cold clarity. The secret was out. The penniless hermit was a man of substance, and the benevolent protectors were revealed as desperate debtors. They're going to try to settle, Silas, Evelyn said without looking up. Your father's lawyer just sent a frantic email. They want to withdraw the petition in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement regarding their financial situation. They're terrified of what the public record will do to their remaining reputation. No, I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, low, steady, and devoid of the old tremors. I want to take the stand. I want the judge to hear my story. I want it on the record once and for all that I am not their property. Evelyn finally looked up, a glimmer of genuine respect in her eyes. Then we go all the way. But be ready. When you go on the offensive, people like Alistair Vane don't go down quietly, they bite. When we re-entered the courtroom, the atmosphere had soured. My father wouldn't look at me. He was whispering fiercely to Sterling Vance. My mother looked as though she had aged 10 years in 60 minutes, her perfect makeup unable to hide the hollows beneath her eyes. Julian, however, was staring at me with a new, hungry intensity. He wasn't looking at his brother, he was looking at a $3 million jackpot. The court calls Silas Vane to the stand, Judge Miller announced. I walked to the box, my heart beating with the slow, heavy rhythm of a war drum. I took the oath, my hand steady on the Bible. Mr. Vane, Evelyn began, standing near the jury box to give me the floor. Your parents have claimed that your life is a series of unhealthy obsessions and financial failures. Tell the court, why did you leave your family home 10 years ago? I took a breath, looking directly at the judge. I left because in that house, I was an asset, not a human being. My parents didn't want a son, they wanted a placeholder for their own ambitions. When I showed an interest in history and preservation, they didn't see a passion, they saw a defect. My father told me I was a failure before I had even begun. I left to find a world where my value wasn't measured by a stock ticker. And how did you manage to build the estate we see today on a researcher's salary? By being invisible, I said, a small smile playing on my lips. I spent my weekends at rural estate sales while my brother was at country clubs. I learned to identify value where others saw junk. I found a collection of letters from the Civil War in a damp basement in Ohio for $500. They were worth $50,000. I invested every spare cent into historical land trusts and rare manuscripts. I didn't buy luxury cars to impress neighbors. I bought a 1968 Mustang in pieces and spent 3 years learning how to make it roar. I built my life brick by brick, while they were busy mortgaging theirs to keep up appearances. Your parents claim you are unstable because you cut off communication, Evelyn prompted. I cut them off to survive, I replied, my voice dropping an octave. Every phone call was a reminder that I wasn't enough. Every holiday was an audition for a role I didn't want to play. When I finally stopped answering, it wasn't because I was lost. It was because I had finally found myself. I didn't need their permission to exist anymore. Sterling Vance stood up for the cross-examination, his face red. Mr. Vane, isn't it true that you've harbored a deep-seated resentment toward your parents? Isn't this entire success story just a vengeful plot to embarrass them? I didn't do this for them, I said firmly. I did this for the truth. If they are embarrassed by the fact that their son is successful and they are bankrupt, that is a reflection of their choices, not mine. They brought me to court to take my freedom because they ran out of their own. That isn't love, Mr. Vance. That's a hostile takeover. You're a liar, my father suddenly barked from his seat. You stole those opportunities. You should have brought those investments to the firm. The gavel slammed down like a gunshot. Mr. Vane, one more outburst and you will be removed, Judge Miller warned. She turned her gaze back to me, her expression softening for a fraction of a second. Mr. Vane, if this court denies this petition today, what are your intentions regarding your family? I want exactly what I've had for the last 10 years, Your Honor, I said. Silence. I want the right to walk out of this room and never have to defend my sanity to people who only value me for my net worth. I want my life back. I stepped down from the stand. As I walked past my parents' table, I felt the heat of their fury, but it didn't burn me. For the first time, I felt completely insulated. I was the one with the archives, the records, and the truth. They were just people sitting in a room, clutching at shadows. The courtroom felt smaller as the finality of my testimony settled over the room. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and the bitter tang of exposed secrets. My parents sat like statues carved from ice, but the ice was beginning to melt into something ugly and desperate. My brother Julian was leaning back, his eyes darting between me and my father, likely calculating which side of the wreckage he should stand on to salvage his own future. Does the petitioner have any further witnesses or evidence to present? Judge Miller asked, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. Sterling Vance looked at my father, who was staring at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. He looked at my mother, who was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief that looked increasingly like a white flag. No, Your Honor, Sterling muttered, his usual bravado completely extinguished. The petitioners have no further evidence. Very well, Judge Miller said. She leaned back in her high-backed chair, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Before I make my ruling, I want to address the parties directly. This court sees many families torn apart by tragedy, by illness, and by genuine misfortune. But rarely do I see a case where the legal system is so blatantly used as a weapon for personal gain. A conservatorship is a tool of protection, not a tool of acquisition. She turned her gaze to my parents, her expression hardening into something truly formidable. Mr. And Mrs. Vane, you came into this court claiming your son was a shell of a man. You claimed he was drowning in a world of dusty shadows, unable to provide for himself or make rational decisions. However, the evidence suggests that the only people in this room facing financial ruin and a break from reality are yourselves. My mother let out a small, strangled sob, but the judge didn't blink. The audit shows that Silas Vane has built a life of extraordinary discipline and intellectual depth. He has preserved history while you were busy hollowing out your own. He has managed his assets with more foresight and wisdom than most professional bankers I know. To suggest he is incompetent is not just a legal error, it is an insult to the very concept of independence. She picked up the gavel. The petition for the conservatorship of Silas Vane is denied. Furthermore, I am referring the financial documents regarding Alastair Vane's firm and the allegations of tax evasion and misappropriation of funds to the district attorney's office for further investigation. The sound of the gavel hitting the bench was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a prison door opening. It was the sound of my name being given back to me. Pandemonium broke out, but it was a quiet, suffocating kind of chaos. My father stood up, his face ashen, and began to argue with Sterling Vance in hissed whispers. My mother finally broke, her head falling into her hands as the weight of the judge's referral sank in. They hadn't just lost the case, they had lost their shield. By trying to drag my life into the light, they had accidentally exposed the rot in their own. Evelyn Thorne placed a hand on my shoulder. It's over, Silas, let's go. As we walked toward the exit, my brother Julian intercepted us. He didn't look angry, he looked predatory. Hey, Silas, look, things got a bit out of hand, but 3.2 million, that's impressive, man. We should grab a drink, talk about some investment opportunities I've been looking at, keep it in the family. I stopped and looked at him. I saw the same hunger in his eyes that I had seen in my father's for 30 years. He hadn't learned a thing, he just saw a new source of fuel for the Vane fire. I don't have a family, Julian, I said, my voice as cold as the manuscripts I spent my life protecting. I have a collection, and you aren't a piece I'm interested in acquiring. I walked past him, leaving him standing in the middle of the aisle, a golden child who was suddenly very much alone. When I stepped outside the courthouse, the iron gray sky had broken, and a thin, sharp sliver of sunlight was hitting the pavement. I took a deep breath of the cold air. For the first time in 10 years, I wasn't waiting for a letter. I wasn't waiting for a phone call. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. What now? Evelyn asked, standing beside me. Now, I said, looking out at the city. I'm going to my garage. I'm going to start the Mustang. And I'm going to drive until the sound of their voices is nothing but a faint static in my rearview mirror. I walked away from the courthouse, my footsteps sounding solid and sure on the stone. I had spent my life studying the past, but for the first time I was looking straight at the future. And it was mine. Every brick, every book, every mile, it was all mine. I drove for hours. The roar of the 1968 Shelby Mustang was a guttural, honest sound that drowned out the echoes of the courtroom. The vibration of the steering wheel felt like a pulse, a reminder that I was alive, sovereign, and finally untethered. The city gave way to rolling hills and skeletal winter trees, the landscape as stark and clean as my new reality. I ended up at a small, weathered pier overlooking a frozen lake, miles away from the Vane Manor and the life they tried to steal. As I sat there, the adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by a profound, hollow silence. I realized that while I had won the war, I was standing in the ruins of my origin story. Every memory of my childhood now felt tainted, a long game played by two people who saw their son as a safety net they could deploy when their own greed caught up with them. The letters, the manuscripts, the Mustang, they weren't just hobbies. They were the walls of a fortress I had been building since I was 6 years old, instinctively knowing that one day I would have to defend my soul. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Evelyn. The DA's office has already frozen your father's corporate accounts. The news is going to break tomorrow morning. You might want to stay off the grid for a few days. The media loves a fallen titan story. I didn't reply. I turned the phone off and watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the ice in shades of violet and gold. I thought about the manuscripts back in my apartment, the journals of explorers who had lost everything but their names, the letters of soldiers who fought for a home they would never see again. I realized I was part of that lineage now. I was a survivor of a different kind of combat. The next morning, I woke up in a small bed and breakfast. I walked down to the common room where a television was humming in the corner. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen made my breath hitch. Alastair Vane, pillar of investment banking, facing charges of multi-million-dollar fraud. There was a grainy photo of my father leaving the courthouse, his jacket pulled over his head, looking like a common criminal. Beside him, my mother was visible for a split second, her face a mask of pure terror. They weren't just losing their money, they were losing the only thing they ever truly valued, their image. The masterpiece was torn. The colonial house, the luxury cars, the country club memberships, it was all going to be liquidated to pay back the people they had robbed. For a moment, I felt a twinge of the old guilt, the good son reflex that had been beaten into me. But then I remembered the way my mother had looked at me in court, the sheer annoyance that I wouldn't just crumble and let them use me. I remembered my father's roar of pennies when he realized I was worth more than he was. The guilt evaporated, replaced by a cold, steady peace. I spent the day walking through the woods, the crunch of snow beneath my boots the only sound. I thought about what it meant to be an archivist. My job was to preserve the truth, no matter how ugly or painful. I realized that the trial wasn't just a legal victory, it was my final archival project. I had documented the truth of the Vane family, filed it away in the public record, and closed the folder forever. That evening, I returned to the city. My apartment felt different, larger, brighter, and entirely silent. I walked over to the shelf and picked up a small, leather-bound diary I hadn't looked at in years. It was my own. I had started it the night I left home at 24. I flipped to the last page and picked up a pen. Today the world knows who I am, I wrote. Not the son of Alastair Vane, not a fragile boy in need of a keeper. I am Silas Vane, a man who knows the value of silence, the weight of history, and the price of freedom. The debt is paid. I closed the book and placed it back on the shelf, perfectly aligned with the others. I was no longer a faulty prototype. I was the architect of my own life. 3 days after the verdict, the world outside my door was in a state of frantic motion, but inside my apartment, the air was still. The news of the Vane family's downfall had spread like a wildfire through the city's elite circles. My father's firm had collapsed overnight, and the legal vultures were already circling the remains of their estate. I stayed inside, surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and the steady hum of my own life. The doorbell rang at noon on Friday. I expected it to be a process server or perhaps a persistent journalist. Instead, when I looked through the peephole, I saw my brother Julian. He wasn't wearing his usual bespoke suit. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, his expensive hair matted and unwashed. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the gold he had been chasing was actually lead. I opened the door, but I didn't step back to let him in. I stood in the threshold, a living wall between his chaos and my peace. "What do you want, Julian?" My voice was flat, devoid of the anger that used to consume me when he spoke. "They're taking everything, Silas," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The house, the cars, even Mom's piano. Dad's being indicted on Monday. He's going to prison, and Mom. She's a mess. She's staying in a motel because the bank changed the locks on the manor this morning." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of the brotherly devotion he had spent a lifetime mocking. "You have $3 million, Silas. You have a paid-off apartment. Just help us, we're family. Give me enough to get Mom a place. I'll pay you back, I swear. I have a deal in the works." "Stop," I interrupted. The word was a scalpel. "The deal you have in the works is the same deal our father had for 30 years. It's a ghost. It's a lie wrapped in a promise." "Silas, please." He stepped forward, a desperate heat coming off him. "You're really going to let our mother sleep in a motel? After everything she did for you?" "What did she do for me, Julian?" I asked, leaning against the door frame. "She watched me walk out into the snow with nothing but a suitcase and never called. She sat in a courtroom and told a judge I was mentally incompetent so she could steal my savings to pay for your gambling debts. She didn't raise a son, she raised a backup plan. And I'm not a plan anymore, I'm a person." "You're a monster," Julian hissed, the desperation turning into the familiar vein venom. "You're sitting on a fortune while your own flesh and blood is starving. You're just as cold as they said you were." "I'm not cold, Julian, I'm just finished," I said calmly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a check for $5,000. I had written it that morning knowing he would show up. "This is it. This is the last transaction between us. Take it, get her a month in a decent place, and tell her to find a job. The era of the veins is over. You can either learn to work like I did, or you can drown in the shadow of the manor. The choice is yours." He snatched the check from my hand, his fingers trembling with a mix of greed and hatred. He didn't say thank you. He turned and ran down the stairs, his footsteps echoing like a hollow heartbeat. I closed the door and locked it. I felt a strange sensation in my chest, not pain, not joy, but a profound sense of completion. The final cord had been cut. That evening, I went back to the archives. Mrs. Gable was there, waiting with a bottle of champagne and 2 paper cups. She didn't ask about the trial or the scandal. She simply pointed to a new crate of documents that had arrived from an old estate in the valley. "Ready to get back to work, Silas?" she asked, her eyes twinkling behind her glasses. "There are stories in there that have been waiting 100 years to be told." "I'm ready," I said. I picked up a pair of white cotton gloves and reached into the crate. My hands didn't shake, my heart didn't race. I was exactly where I was meant to be. My parents had tried to bury me, but they didn't realize I was a seed. I had grown in the dark, nourished by the very silence they used to punish me. Now I was standing in the sun, and the history I was preserving was no longer theirs. It was mine. A month had passed since the gavel fell, and the city's gossip columns had finally moved on to a new scandal. My father's trial was set for the spring, and Julian had vanished into the gray periphery of the city, likely trying to charm his way into someone else's bank account with the $5,000 I had given him. For the first time in 34 years, the name Vane carried no weight. It was just a word, a collection of letters on a page, stripped of its power to haunt me. I spent my Saturday morning in the local park, sitting on a bench with a cup of black coffee. It was a simple pleasure, one my mother would have found common and my father would have dismissed as unproductive. But to me, it was the ultimate luxury. I watched a young father teaching his daughter how to fly a kite. He didn't yell when the string got tangled. He didn't check his watch or look around to see who was watching. He just laughed and knelt in the grass to help her. I realized then that I had missed out on a certain kind of childhood, but I was making up for it with a very intentional adulthood. Evelyn Thorne joined me a few minutes later, looking less like a legal shark and more like a woman who enjoyed a brisk autumn walk. She sat down beside me, handing me a small, leather-bound folder. "The final papers, Silas," she said. "The restraining orders are permanent. The court has also issued a formal apology for the oversight in the initial petition. Your records are sealed, and your assets are officially flagged. No one can touch a cent without 3 layers of biometric verification and my personal sign-off." "Thank you, Evelyn," I said, tucking the folder into my bag, "for everything. You did the hard part, Silas. You stayed standing when most people would have crumbled. Most victims of predatory guardianships don't have the foresight to build a fortress before the war starts. You were your own best witness." She paused, looking out at the lake. "What will you do now? The Smithsonian offer is still on the table. They're practically begging for your expertise on the Revolutionary War period." I looked at my hands, the hands that had restored engines, cataloged ancient letters, and held steady under the gaze of a judge. "I think I'll take it, but I'm not moving. I'll consult from here. I like my apartment. I like the light in my library. I've spent too long running away from places. I think I'd like to stay in one for a while." "Good for you," she smiled, standing up. "Just remember, Silas, you don't owe the world your story. You only owe yourself the truth." As she walked away, I felt a vibration in my pocket. It was a private number. I hesitated for a second, then answered. "Silas?" It was my mother. Her voice was thin, brittle, like old parchment left in the sun for too long. There was no performance this time. No weeping, no melodic sorrow, just a tired, broken woman. I just wanted to say that the motel is very loud. I can't sleep. The walls are so thin." I listened to the sound of her breathing on the other end. 10 years ago, I would have rushed to her side. 5 years ago, I would have shouted in rage. But now, I felt nothing but the quiet detachment of an archivist looking at a faded photograph. "The world is loud, Alina," I said softly. "You just spent 40 years making sure you couldn't hear it. Now you have to learn to listen." "Do you hate us?" she whispered. "No," I replied, and I meant it. "Hate is a connection. It's a string that keeps us tied together. I don't hate you. I've just archived you. You're part of a chapter I've already finished writing." There was a long silence on the other end. I didn't wait for her to respond. I ended the call and blocked the number. It was the final period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I walked back to my apartment, the air crisp and smelling of wood smoke. When I entered my library, I went to the center of the room where a new acquisition sat on my desk. A series of ship logs from an 18th century merchant vessel that had been lost at sea for 2 years before finally finding its way home. I ran my fingers over the rough leather binding. I was home, too. The veins had tried to turn my life into a tragedy, a cautionary tale of a son who couldn't measure up, but they forgot that I was the one who held the pen. I had rewritten the ending. I wasn't the victim of their greed, I was the victor of my own resilience. I opened the logbook and began to read, the quiet of the room a testament to the life I had fought for and won. "My name is Silas Vane, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly who I was meant to be. Actually, Silas's journey reached its natural and emotional conclusion in the 10th part. We've covered his childhood trauma, the betrayal of the court summons, the tactical legal battle, the shocking reveal of his secret wealth, the exposure of his parents' crimes, and finally, his total emotional liberation. However, since you've asked for next, and we have plenty of room to deepen the resolution and provide a postscript to his new life, ensuring we hit that emotional high for your YouTube audience, here is a special epilogue to wrap everything up with a final, powerful message. 6 months later, the name Silas Vane was no longer synonymous with a family scandal. It was a name associated with the Vane discovery. A set of journals I had found years ago, belonging to a forgotten female pioneer, had been officially published with my commentary. It became a bestseller in the academic world, and the royalties were already flowing into a foundation I had started, the Autonomy Project. It was a legal fund designed to help young adults fighting predatory guardianships. I wasn't just saving history anymore, I was saving futures. I was standing in the Grand Hall of the City Historical Society, which was hosting a gala for the opening of my curated exhibit. The room was filled with the very people my parents had spent their lives trying to impress. They were all there, sipping expensive champagne and whispering my name, but the difference was that I wasn't there to perform. I was the guest of honor, and I was wearing a suit I had bought with my own hard-earned money, not a costume provided by my father. Mrs. Gable walked up to me looking radiant in a velvet dress. "You look like you're miles away, Silas," she said, handing me a glass of sparkling water. "I was just thinking about the first day I walked in here," I said, looking at the display cases. I was 24, terrified, and I had exactly $42 in my pocket. I thought the world was a very small, very cold place. "And now?" she asked. "Now I know the world is as big as you dare to make it," I replied. As the evening wound down, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance. It was Julian. He didn't try to come in. The security guards I had hired knew exactly who he was. He looked older, his face gaunt. He caught my eye through the glass doors. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked empty. He saw me standing there, surrounded by respect and success, and he realized the truth. He had traded his soul for a seat at a table that no longer existed. He turned and disappeared into the night, a ghost of a life that never was. I walked home that night instead of taking a car. I wanted to feel the pavement beneath my feet. When I reached my apartment, I didn't turn on all the lights. I just sat in my library, the moonlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the thousands of books that had been my only friends when the world was dark. I realized that my parents had given me one thing, though they never intended to. They gave me the gift of a clean slate. By trying to take everything, they had freed me from the burden of their expectations. I didn't have to be a Vane, I didn't have to be an analyst. I didn't have to be anything other than the man I was in this moment. I picked up the Revolutionary War letter I had discussed in court, the one from the soldier to his wife. I reread the final line: "The battle is won, but the peace is where the work truly begins." I smiled and set the letter down. My work, my real life, was just beginning. The silence of the room was no longer a lonely thing. It was a beautiful, expansive space, waiting to be filled with new stories, new discoveries, and a truth that no one could ever take away from me again. My name is Silas Vane. I am an archivist, a restorer, and a free man. And for the first time in my life, I am not afraid of Tuesday mornings. 1 year had passed since the courthouse doors swung shut on the ghosts of my past. My life had become a masterclass in the beauty of the mundane. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of birds in the cedar tree outside my window rather than the sharp, panicked ringing of a phone. I had moved my archives into a larger, sun-drenched studio downtown, a space that breathed with the stories of 1,000 lives. I was no longer a man hiding from the world. I was a man curating it. The final chapter of the Vane legacy arrived not with a bang, but with a simple, official letter from the state penitentiary. My father had been sentenced to 7 years. He had declined all visitors, including my mother. Elena, unable to maintain the facade of the socialite in a world that now knew her as a conspirator, had moved to a small coastal town under her maiden name. She lived a quiet, invisible life, the very thing she had once told me was a fate worse than death. I realized then that her punishment wasn't poverty, it was the lack of an audience. I stood on the balcony of my studio, looking out over the city as the first snow of winter began to fall. The flakes were delicate, silent, and transformative, much like the truth. I thought about the boy I used to be, the one who thought love was something you had to earn through perfect grades and silent obedience. I wished I could go back and tell him that the defect they saw in him was actually his greatest strength. His quietness wasn't a void, it was a reservoir of resilience. Evelyn Thorne stopped by that evening, not as my lawyer, but as a friend. She brought a rare 1920s map of the city she'd found at an estate sale. We sat among my books, talking not of laws and petitions, but of the future. "You've changed, Silas," she said, tracing the lines of the old map. "There's a gravity to you now. You're not just surviving anymore, you're grounded." "I think I finally stopped waiting for permission to exist," I replied. "It's amazing how much energy you save when you aren't constantly bracing for an attack." "And the collection?" she asked, gesturing to the rows of meticulously catalogued history. "It's growing. But I'm starting to donate the major pieces to public museums. History shouldn't be locked in a private vault, not mine and not theirs. It belongs to everyone. It's a reminder that no matter how hard someone tries to rewrite your story, the truth always leaves a trail." After she left, I walked through my library one last time before bed. I stopped at a mirror near the door. For the first time, I didn't see the features of Alistair or Elena Vane in my face. I saw my own eyes, clear and steady. I saw a man who had been through the fire and come out tempered, not broken. I realized that the Vane family portrait had finally been replaced. The new image wasn't a masterpiece of public perception or a display of wealth. It was just me, standing in a quiet room, surrounded by the things I loved, holding a pen that belonged entirely to me. The world would always have people like my parents, people who see others as rungs on a ladder or tools for their own survival. But the world also has archivists. It has people who remember, people who protect, and people who refuse to let the quiet voices be drowned out by the loud ones. My name is Silas Vane. I am 35 years old. I am a son who lost his family and a man who found himself. My life is not a transaction, and my soul is not for sale. As I turned off the light, I felt the weight of the silence around me. It wasn't the cold, thin silence of the Vane Manor. It was the warm, deep silence of a home. And for the first time in my life, I knew that whatever happened when the sun came up, I would be ready, I would be whole, and I would be free.